subject of today's session is undoubtedly one of the best known of the biblical holy days, and I suspect, for the most part, one of the most poorly understood. As we've noted many times, what we are describing as the biblical holy days are popularly known as Jewish holidays, which undoubtedly they are, but since they are in the Bible, they are biblical holy days. And while the obligation to observe them is one that God places upon Israel, obviously their messages are relevant to all those who regard the Bible as God's word to them, Jews and non-Jews. And that certainly is true of the holy day that I'd like to explore with you through the words of the Bible today, what is generally known as the Day of Atonement, Yom Kippur, or in the parlance of the Torah, the Bible, Yom HaKippurim, which essentially is the same word. Let's try to see what the Bible has to tell us about this profound and in many ways mysterious day. The Torah mentions this day in 3 separate passages explicitly. There is another passage that refers to it, which we will not be discussing today. We've discussed it in other sessions. But focusing upon the first of the explicit references to this day, we turn to Leviticus chapter 16. Now, in our studies of the Torah, the 5 books of Moses, we have discussed Leviticus chapter 16 at somewhat greater length. And the truth is that most of what is described as the service on Yom Kippur in Leviticus chapter 16 doesn't apply directly to any of us. It applies directly to one single solitary individual, the high priest, of course, only when the Holy Temple is standing here in Jerusalem. And to that extent, it doesn't apply to anyone nowadays. However, from verse 29 in Leviticus chapter 16, the perspective is much broader, and it undoubtedly does pertain to the observance of this extraordinary day for all generations. Again, from verse 29 in Leviticus chapter 16, and it shall be a statute forever unto you. In the 7th month, on the 10th day of the month, you shall afflict your lives, and shall do no manner of work, the homeborn, or the stranger, or proselyte, who sojourns among you. We'll note that in this opening presentation, there are 2 specific aspects of the observance of this day that are stated. I'll note that this day, of course, takes place in the 7th month, but we already discussed the significance of the 7th month when we spoke about Rosh Hashanah. For now, note the emphases on afflicting your lives. One could translate it as afflicting your souls, but the Hebrew, nefesh, doesn't really carry the connotation of transcendence in most instances, certainly not here. It refers to one's vitality, the life force. And to that extent, you afflict your lives. How? Of course, by continuous tradition of Israel, that means fasting. It's significant to note, however, that the text does not state fasting. You might be wondering if there is a word in biblical Hebrew that literally means fast, and there is, and we'll be discussing it shortly, but not in the context of Yom Kippur. Because in every instance in which Yom Kippur appears in the Bible, in the Torah, that verb is not used. Rather, The theme is afflicting your lives. And shall do no manner of work. That is a prohibition on engaging in creative labor. As we've noted, and we'll be returning to this point shortly, on both the Sabbath, Shabbat, and the major holy days, there are different gradations of prohibitions on engaging in creative labor. And to that extent, the Torah here affirms that on Yom Kippur, all manner of creative labor, everything that is prohibited, indeed, on Shabbat, on the Sabbath, is prohibited as well. Now, these are two aspects, admittedly the two central aspects, of the observance of Yom Kippur. There is inevitably an additional crucial theme that needs to be introduced, and it is introduced in verse 30. It was, after all, the principal focus of the foregoing prescription for the Yom Kippur service conducted by the high priest, and that is, verse 30, on this day shall atonement be made for you, to purify you from all your sins. You shall be purified before God. That aspect of atonement, which admittedly we're going to need to discuss shortly. But again, in verse 31, we return to the two principal motifs in observance of this day. It is a Sabbath of solemn rest unto you, and you shall afflict your lives. The Sabbath of solemn rest, again affirming the prohibition on doing what we usually render as work, but more rigorously doing creative labor. You observe it as a Sabbath, and you afflict your lives. And again, in verses 32, 33, and 34, centrally, the aspect of atonement. Just to summarize with verses 33 and 34, the priest shall make atonement for the most holy place, and he shall make atonement for the tent of meeting and for the altar, and he shall make atonement for the priests and for all the people of the assembly. And this shall be an everlasting statute unto you, to make atonement for the people of Israel, because of all their sins once in the year. A summary of Yom Kippur. So for us to summarize now, again, we saw two central aspects of observance: the self-affliction and the observance of Sabbath rest from creative labor. And of course, the central theme describing this holy day, the theme of atonement. But of course, as you can well imagine, we're not going to be satisfied merely by using the word atonement, because inevitably then we'll need to ask, what does atonement mean? And the truth is, in the context of our study of the Bible, I don't really care what atonement means, because the Bible doesn't say atonement. The Bible, of course, doesn't say anything in English at all. The Bible uses the verb v'chiper. It speaks of lichaper, which indeed is generally translated as atonement. But in order for us to best elucidate what this word means, we inevitably revert to a course that we have followed in many other instances as well, noting that all words in biblical Hebrew derive from three-letter roots. The three letters for the Hebrew experts are Kaf, Pe, Resh. And inevitably then, if we want to understand what the word really invokes, we consider how this root appears in other senses in the Bible. That is, of course, to merely use other instances in which we would translate it as atonement won't help us very much in elucidating what atonement really means. So we consider a number of other examples. To keep things relatively brief, we'll consider 4 examples in Genesis and Exodus where the same root appears in very different senses. Inevitably, part of our challenge is going to be to figure out what these senses have in common. We begin, first instance in which this root appears, in Genesis chapter 6, when we read of God's instructions to Noah pertaining to building the ark. In verse 14, make you an ark of gopher wood, with rooms you shall make the ark, and shall pitch it, within and without, with pitch. Pitch, or tar, is obviously a waterproofing material, and we'll just note that pitching in Hebrew is v'chafarta, the pitch is kofer. They are both clearly derivative of the same 3-letter root. We continue with a very different context in which this root appears, and that is in Genesis chapter 32, when we read of Jacob sending his lavish gift to Esau. To what end? As expressed in Genesis chapter 32, verse 21, for he said, I will appease him with the present that goes before me, and afterward I will see his face. Perhaps he will accept me. I will appease him. In Hebrew, achapera, again, the same 3-letter root. I hope you're paying attention to these various examples and trying, as I speak, to figure out what do all these have in common with one another, much less what do they have in common with atonement. But first we continue with our list. Our third example is in Exodus chapter 16. In Exodus chapter 16, we of course read about the manna. And what we read of the first encounter of the nation with the manna in verse 14 was, and when the layer of dew was gone up, behold, upon the face of the wilderness, a fine grain-like or flaky or bare thing, fine as the hoarfrost upon the earth. Hoarfrost, frost. The Hebrew, kfor. Here it is. You may note, once again, the same 3-letter root. What does frost have to do with it, I think? And finally, the last example actually pertains to a word that we find repeatedly in Scripture, in particular, in reference to the tabernacle and its vessels. Its first occurrence is in Exodus chapter 25, when we read of God's instructions to Moses concerning the tabernacle and its vessels, after the description of the Holy Ark, which was essentially a box without any cover on it. And you shall make an ark cover. In Exodus chapter 25, verse 17, an ark cover of pure gold, the dimensions of the ark in order to sit on top of it. Well, the Hebrew for ark cover is kaporet. And kaporet, again, derives from the same 3-letter root. So, what is this root teaching us? And of course, inevitably, what we really need to ask is, what has it to do with atonement? What common denominator is there among these 4 widely disparate occurrences of this root, and what has that common denominator to do with atonement? And of course, the answer, as you may have already surmised in trying to figure out what these instances have in common, is covering up. Covering up, after all, is precisely what you do when you have the bare wood of the boat, the ark, that needs to be waterproofed. So you cover the wood with waterproofing pitch That act of pitching the wood is an act of covering up. The pitch itself, of course, is the cover. So obviously, in pitching the ark within and without with pitch, you're doing something that covers. Admittedly, what Jacob is doing is somewhat less obvious, but when we consider what was going on here, Esau, Jacob has already learned, is coming toward him with 400 men, 400 soldiers, and for all that Jacob anticipates, he's coming furious, ready to attack. Now, what happened in the past between Jacob and Esau cannot, in any likelihood, simply be erased. But we can try to smooth over things. Smoothing over is a very apropos idiomatic expression in English. In essence, it means cover things over. There is something rough, something harsh underneath. Well, we'll leave it underneath and cover it over with something that will smooth things over. The gift, of course, is intended to do just that. And it is in that vein that Jacob says, I will appease him. I will cover over his anger with this gift. And then, when I see him, I hope he'll accept me. With respect to our third example, the hoarfrost, well, that actually should be fairly obvious. Frost, of course, covers the earth. We'll note that in Hebrew, there's a word, a completely separate word, not at all derivative of the same root, for snow. That word is sheleg. Kfor is specifically the frost that forms a layer on the earth, a layer on other things when the air is cold enough, but frost covers. And of course, finally, and I think most obviously, the ark cover is a cover. So all of these words have some connotation of covering. And I think it is through them that we can glean a crucial insight into what the Torah means in speaking of this day as a day of atonement. On the one hand, the agent in that atonement, in the service described in Leviticus chapter 16, is the high priest. But of course, on the other, ultimately, the one, the only one, who dispenses atonement is God. And what does atonement mean in this vein? Well, here, as in our other illustrations of this root, we realize the past, sadly enough, happened. There are aspects of the past that we may be able to undo, but there are also aspects that we cannot. The past looms in the background, looms and maybe overwhelms. And a person can readily become so paralyzed by the past that one loses the ability to move forward into the future. Now, again, it would be nice to be able to press a restart button and revisit everything that happened in that past that we would love to be able to undo. A restart button is often, maybe usually, not available. But God gives us a day of atonement. God gives us an opportunity to be able to cover over what happened in the past, to start a new leaf, to start afresh, knowing that the past is there, but it doesn't overwhelm us. It doesn't paralyze us, because God, in his boundless kindness, has given us the gift of covering it over. It is, of course, a gift that makes demands of us. What it demands of us is earnest repentance, striving, struggling to come to terms with that past in a manner that enables us to cover it over. But then God does cover it over. That is the atonement. That is the gift that is the central motif of Yom Kippur. But now, once again, in considering what that demands of us, we remember those two central aspects of observance: self-affliction and Sabbath rest, ceasing from creative work. We'll note that all three of these themes appear once again in the second passage in which this holy day appears in the Bible. This is in Leviticus chapter 23. We noted this passage in our discussion of Rosh Hashanah, of the New Year, and indeed it follows immediately on the heels of the description of the holy day that takes place on the first day of the seventh month. In Leviticus chapter 23, the manner in which this holy day is first introduced in verse 27, howbeit on the 10th day of this seventh month is the Day of Atonement. This, we'll note, is the first place in the Bible where this name appears. There shall be a holy convocation unto you, and you shall afflict your lives, and you shall bring an offering made by fire unto God. And, verse 28, you shall do no manner of work in that same day, for it is a day of atonement. The name recurs, to make atonement for you before God your Lord. So, of course, we note that in verses 27 and 28, we have once again the two central aspects of observance, that is, the self-affliction and not doing any manner of work, the Sabbath rest. What follows in verses 29 and 30 is a sense of the severity of this day, that is, the punishment that is the destiny of one who disobeys these two mandates, one who does not engage in the self-affliction thing, and one who does any manner of forbidden work. And by way of summation, we read in verse 32, it shall be unto you a Sabbath of solemn rest. Again, that aspect that pertains to not doing creative labor. And you shall afflict your lives. In the 9th day of the month at evening, from evening unto evening, shall you keep your Sabbath. Once again, those two themes of observance, curiously intertwined. We'll return to that in a moment. Before we do, just to note that the third instance in which this holy day appears in the Bible, in Numbers chapter 29, verse 7, in the context of the details of the various offerings that are brought on all the holidays. And admittedly, given that that's the context, it seems almost gratuitous to speak of other observances that pertain to the day, but still in all, there they are, front and center, in Numbers chapter 29, verse 7, and you shall afflict your souls, your lives, and you shall do no manner of work. Clearly, every instance that Yom Kippur is described explicitly in the Torah, it's described with these motifs of observance. We need to understand, what do they mean? And In attempting to do so, I'd like to, as I noted, return to Leviticus chapter 23, verse 32. A curious and confusing statement. Again, the verse begins by stating, "It shall be unto you a Sabbath of solemn rest," referring to the sabbatical aspect of refraining from creative labor. The verse ends with, "You're keeping your Sabbath." Again, the same theme of a sabbatical observance of desisting from creative labor, from work. But in the middle, instead of talking about work, it talks about self-affliction, afflicting your lives. It doesn't say anything about work per se, which seems awfully strange. It seems as if the way we are summoned to observe this holiday as a day of solemn rest is specifically by the self-affliction of our refraining from eating and drinking and refraining from various other bodily needs that pertain the rest of the year. What has this to do with the Sabbath? After all, it's instructive for us to recall what the Sabbath is. More precisely, whence it comes. The first Sabbath, the seventh day in God's creation. In Genesis chapter 2, in verses 2 and 3, and on the seventh day, God finished his work. Again, work in the Hebrew, melacha, means creative labor. He had created everything, after all, in the previous days of creation. So he finished that creative labor that he had made, and he ceased. He desisted from such creative activity on the seventh day from all of his work, all of his creative labor that he had made. And he blessed the seventh day and hallowed it. So we will understand that inasmuch as what God did prior to that heavenly Sabbath was creation, we don't create. Well, that's all well and good, and we understand how that is manifest in our observance of the Sabbath. We discussed this at much greater length in discussing Exodus chapter 35 and the great gift of the Sabbath that God gives us. But what has that to do with self-affliction? Let's frame this question in terms of another very practical question. That is, since after all, the date of Yom Kippur is explicitly set in the Bible, in the passages we just saw, the 10th day of the 7th month, and since the 10th day of the 7th month can occur on the Sabbath, on Shabbat, what happens if they coincide? That is, we realize that Shabbat is a day of pleasure, eating, drinking, relief. Yom Kippur, a day of self-affliction. So what happens if Yom Kippur occurs on the 7th day? I think everyone is aware that this does indeed take place in our calendar, and under such circumstances, we fast on Shabbat. We fast because of Yom Kippur, when it is a Shabbat of Yom Kippur. But in order to appreciate what that signifies, we should compare that to another set of days. Now, I mentioned at the very outset here that what is not stated with respect to Yom Kippur at all is the verb fasting. That verb does appear in the context of some other fast days. We read in Zechariah chapter 7 of the question that was sent to the priests of the Holy Temple of the house of God and the prophets. In Zechariah chapter 7, verse 3, should I weep in the 5th month, separating myself as I have done these so many years? What's the 5th month? Well, of course, recalling that we always count months, as we discussed in our study of Rosh Hashanah, from the month of Pesach, the month of Passover, Nisan. The 5th month is the month we call Av. The 5th month is the month in which the Holy Temple was destroyed. Indeed, while weeping in the 5th month in Zechariah refers to the destruction of the first temple, the second temple was destroyed at the same date. So the weeping in the 5th month is a weeping of commemoration of the destruction. It's interesting that in the question, reference was made only to the 5th month. Immediately in the first statement of God's answer, there is reference to not only the 5th, but also the 7th month. And here, for the first time in the context of this discussion, the verb fasting explicitly appears. When you fasted and mourned in the 5th and in the 7th month, even these 70 years. Now, you might be wondering if the fast of the 7th month has anything to do with Yom Kippur. But then you may recall that it undoubtedly does not, because there's another fast in the 7th month that commemorates the assassination of Gedaliah and the consequent dispersion of the last remnant of the people who had remained in the land of Israel after the first temple was destroyed. So we have here reference to the 5th and 7th month. And in Zechariah chapter 8, we round out this picture with the words of God to Zechariah as expressed in chapter 8, verse 19. Thus says the God of hosts, the fast of the 4th month, and the fast of the 5th, and the fast of the 7th, and the fast of the 10th shall be to the house of Judah joy and gladness and cheerful seasons. But love you, truth and peace. Now, once again, I'll stress, in describing these 4 days, reference to them being Tzom, fast days, is explicit in the text. That expression that we never found in the context of Yom Kippur at all. But now, recognizing that these 4 fasts are clearly all commemorations of the destruction, we have in other contexts discussed each one of them. We're not going to do so now. We return to our question of what happens if a fast day coincides with Shabbat. Do you fast? We already know the answer with respect to Yom Kippur is yes. The Torah ordains that we fast on the 10th day of the 7th month. We do so even when that occurs on Shabbat. What about these fast days? There are a number of angles that we could consider here, such as the fact that these fast days are ordained by the prophets after Moses and the Torah, and therefore they do not have the same status as the laws of the Torah. But on a conceptual plane, we can also appreciate that these days are indeed fasts. They are days of sorrow. They are days of mourning. They are indeed days that are first described in the question as days of weeping, not simply days of fasting. And indeed, in God's response initially, he refers to them as days upon which you fasted and mourned. Mourning can never coexist with the holy, joyous day of Shabbat, the Sabbath. Even when an individual is in mourning for a departed immediate relative, 7 days of mourning, the Shiva period, when Shabbat comes, the mourning practices that are publicly observed are suspended, because in deference to Shabbat, you don't show any indications of mourning at all. And any of these 4 fast days, in the 4th, 5th, 7th, and 10th months, that can occur in principle on Shabbat, are never observed on Shabbat. The observance is always deferred until after Shabbat. That is what we would describe as Sunday, which could include, in the case of the fast of the 5th month, Tisha B'Av, which is observed as a full day fast, from sundown on Shabbat, at the end of Shabbat, through Sunday night, but never on Shabbat itself, because Shabbat takes precedence. And mourning and Shabbat are incompatible. Well, if mourning and Shabbat are incompatible, then what was the logic of positing that when Yom Kippur comes out on Shabbat, we actually observe Yom Kippur as a fast day on Shabbat? Isn't that a contradiction? Inevitably, the answer is no. And we return to Leviticus chapter 23, verse 32, in seeing how that is so. That is, again, recall, it shall be unto you a Sabbath of solemn rest. How is it a Sabbath of solemn rest? You shall afflict your lives. That's the way you keep your Sabbath. On a regular Shabbat, we desist from creative labor. On a Sabbath upon which Yom Kippur coincides, we not only desist from creative labor, we desist from eating and drinking. But it's not fasting. That is, of course, in practice it is. We're not eating or drinking, but it's not called fasting. It is rather the affliction of the body, of the physical. To what end? To rise above the physical. The affliction is a kind of put down of the otherwise exalted status of physicality. There's something else that attains supremacy on Yom Kippur, even when Yom Kippur is on Shabbat. And that observation brings us to an additional nuance to consider in this verse. And that is, I glossed over this part of the verse in reading it earlier, but we need to consider exactly what it tells us at greater length right now. Again, it shall be unto you a Sabbath of solemn rest, and you shall afflict your lives. When? In the 9th day of the month at evening. From evening unto evening shall you keep your Sabbath. The 9th day of the month? We've seen everywhere, including in Leviticus chapter 23, that Yom Kippur is on the 10th day of the 7th month, not the 9th day. So what is meant by referring to the affliction taking place on the 9th day of the month at evening? And while on the one hand, the simple answer to this question, of course, lies in the realization that going all the way back to Genesis chapter 1, the evening always begins the day in the Bible. That is, In chapter 1, verse 5, there was evening and then there was morning, one day. So, simple meaning, the fast begins at the end of the 9th day. The fast begins then at sundown of the 9th day and continues into the 10th day. But still, we always know that days in the biblical calendar begin at sundown. Why describe it in terms of the 9th? It's not the 9th. It's the 10th. And here, I feel compelled to share with you an astounding ancient tradition that we have, which is emphasizing the 9th, specifically to stress that on the 9th, we're eating and drinking all day. The fast only begins at evening, at the end of the 9th day. You don't fast extra. You don't say, maybe I can fast 2 days instead of 1. No. The 9th day you're supposed to be spending eating and drinking. If I may share with you an observation pertaining to this verity in our tradition by one of the great Bible scholars of the 19th century, Rabbi Samson Raphael Hirsch, who presided over his congregation in Frankfurt, Germany, and wrote his commentary in German. I'm reading it in English translation. The fasting on the 9th at evening, the expression that we saw in the text, again, in Leviticus chapter 23, verse 32, can only have the purpose of limiting the fasting to the period, the 10th, when indeed it is Yom Kippur. The fasting may only begin on the 9th when it is night, but on the eve of Yom Kippur, on the 9th, you may not fast. This prohibition to fast on the 9th, on the eve of Yom Kippur, may to a very high degree prove the moral Jewish character of our fasting on Yom Kippur and allow us to understand the tradition recorded by our sages that when one eats and drinks on the 9th, that's considered part of the fulfillment of the fast itself, despite the fact that one is eating and drinking. If our Yom Kippur were the heathen idea of pacifying a wrathful God, and our fasting a heathen, self-torturing castigation to satisfy its thirst for vengeance, if the purpose of Yom Kippur were suffer as much as possible, how much greater would the precept be by a 2 days fast? We'd suffer even more. The law that makes eating and drinking on the eve of Yom Kippur into just a precept, it is part of the fulfillment of the commandment of the self-affliction on Yom Kippur, and which forbids fasting on that day, comes to oppose sharply this immoral and un-Jewish way of looking at Yom Kippur. Our eating on the eve of Yom Kippur is a suitable expression for giving our fasting on Yom Kippur the true meaning of an atonement promised on Yom Kippur itself. Now let's consider what that means. Again, obviously, if the purpose of the fast were to suffer, the longer we wouldn't eat, the greater the suffering. And paradoxically, ironically, we are summoned specifically to eat and drink to the maximum on the eve of Yom Kippur, So that while, of course, we are physical beings, we have physical needs, not eating and drinking for a full day takes its toll. The toll will be as small as possible. You won't really feel hungry because you had a day of eating and drinking that came just before. In other words, lest anyone think that our eating and drinking is forbidden on Yom Kippur in order to make it hurt, in order to make us suffer. This rule comes along to tell us, no, on Yom Kippur, you don't eat and drink, not, again, in the parlance of the Bible because it is a fast, but rather because in the parlance of the Bible, you are afflicting yourself bodily in order to rise to a level that goes beyond the physical. Ideally, if you can do that without even feeling hungry, all the better. Because the goal here isn't to feel hungry. The goal is to rise above physical needs, to rise above eating and drinking. Now, when we consider then what this tells us about the identity of Yom Kippur, then, on the one hand, we could well apply on a fairly straightforward level the thrust of Ecclesiastes, chapter 7, verse 16, be not overly righteous, neither make yourself overly wise. Why should you become desolate? Don't try to do more than you as a human being can rightly be expected to do. That's on the one hand. But on the other hand, there is clearly a theme here, a theme of attaining transcendence. To not eat, not drink, and not feel hunger. You might think that's impossible, but we have precedent. We read in Exodus chapter 34, verse 28, Moses was there with God upon Mount Sinai 40 days and 40 nights. He did neither eat bread nor drink water. And he, God, wrote upon the tablets the words of the covenant, the 10 words. There's no indication that Moses was hungry. He just wasn't eating and drinking. Why wasn't he eating and drinking? Well, we read it. Because he was there with God. You think when you're there with God, you need to eat and drink? Indeed, in Deuteronomy chapter 9, we read about this in somewhat greater detail. In verse 9, when I was gone up into the mount to receive the tablets of stone, even the tablets of the covenant, which God made with you, then I abode in the mount 40 days and 40 nights. I did neither eat bread nor drink water. What happened at the end of those 40 days and 40 nights was, sadly, the sin of the golden calf. And God sends Moses down. The tablets are broken. In verse 18, Moses is back up on the mountain immediately afterward. And I fell down before God as at the first 40 days and 40 nights. I did neither eat bread nor drink water because of all your sin, which you sinned in doing that which was evil in the sight of God to provoke him. A second period, 40 days and 40 nights. No indication, by the way, that he ate anything in the middle. He went down, saw the golden calf. What happened then happened, and he's going right back up the mountain. I feel compelled to share with you that although it's not explicit in the text, in our traditional reckoning of the timeline of the period, Moses went for 3 adjacent 40-day periods without eating and drinking. Because immediately after the theophany at Sinai, he climbs up Mount Sinai for the first 40 days, getting the first set of the tablets. Then, as we already noted, comes down, sees the golden calf, and heads right back up the mountain to entreat God for his forgiveness. That's the second 40-day period. And then God summons Moses to go back up the mountain to receive the second set of tablets. Moses hews the stones, and God writes upon them the words. That was a third 40-day period. I can't help but note here that that count yields the conclusion that Moses, at the conclusion of this third 40-day period, descends either on or on the eve of Yom Kippur. So, consider, Moses went for all these days without eating and drinking. Not hungry, because he was in the presence of God. And at the end of that period, we have an eternal commemoration. It doesn't last 40 days, but we also emulate that level of not eating, not drinking, and to the extent that we are able, not being hungry. The absence of hunger is, in a way, even more explicit in the story of another prophet in the same location. We read in the first book of Kings in chapter 19 that Elijah is summoned by the angel to arise and eat, and after being summoned a second time to arise and eat because the journey is too great for you, we read in chapter 19, verse 8, and he rose and did eat and drink and went in the strength of that meal 40 days and 40 nights unto Horeb, the Mount of God, Mount Sinai. Well, of course, if he was going in the strength of that meal 40 days and 40 nights, he wasn't hungry. He was still going by the strength of that meal. I feel compelled to share with you a Hasidic saying contrasting the fasts culminating in the 9th day of Av that commemorate the destruction of the temple with Yom Kippur. That on the fasts that commemorate the destruction, most dramatically on Tisha B'Av, we don't eat and drink because how can you eat or drink when the temple is a smoldering ruin? On Yom Kippur, we don't eat and drink because when you're standing in God's presence, how can you possibly feel hungry? Now, of course, the precedents that I cited thus far pertain to only two individuals, Moses and Elijah. But then consider, while they went for 40-day periods, maybe more than one, without eating and drinking, God says through Moses in Deuteronomy chapter 29 that the entire nation of Israel went without eating bread for 40 years. In Deuteronomy chapter 29, verse 4, I have led you 40 years in the wilderness. Your clothes are not waxen old upon you. Your shoe is not waxen old upon your foot. Verse 5, you have not eaten bread, neither have you drunk wine or strong drink, that you might know that I am God your Lord. Now, what does that mean, you haven't eaten bread? But they had eaten something. They were eating manna. And indeed, that is, on some plane, precisely the point of what we're noting here. They had the manna. They, therefore, were, while eating the manna, not hungry. But they still weren't eating bread. How could that be? Well, in Psalm 78, which is a psalm that altogether pertains to the events of the Exodus and Israel in the wilderness, we read about the manna. And the description is telling. I'm reading Psalm 78, verses 23 to 25. And he commanded the skies above and opened the doors of heaven. And he caused manna to rain upon them for food and gave them of the corn of heaven. This is literally heavenly sustenance. Man did eat the bread of the mighty. One could render this as of the angels, or the mighty angels. This is angel food. He, God, sent them provisions for satisfaction. They were satisfied. They weren't eating. They, like Moses, neither ate bread nor drank water, in that sense of the term. They were sustained without being hungry through manna, through the miraculous well springs of the well that sustained them as well, which wasn't ordinary water. Ordinary water doesn't flow out of a rock. Note then that this theme of affliction and transcendence is something for which we have considerable precedent. Moses, Elijah, all of Israel in the wilderness, and on an ongoing basis, the commemoration of Yom Kippur. Not eating bread to be like an angel. The manna was angel food. To reach a level that goes so totally beyond this world that one is no longer constrained by the limits of this world. So what Yom Kippur then does is it guides us to functioning like an angel. Which on the one hand is, of course, a crucial insight, because I suspect there are a lot of people who still think of Yom Kippur as some kind of a day of suffering, a day of denial, a day of fasting. But the fast isn't a fast in the ordinary sense of the term. It's a day of transcendence. It's a day of becoming angel-like. So, of course, on the one hand, this clarifies a lot about what Yom Kippur is. But on the other hand, it also raises an extremely vexing, troubling question, because we need to ask ourselves then, what's so great about being like an angel? For us, it's axiomatic that the level of an angel is undoubtedly a lower level than the level of righteous human beings. This is an idea that we can glean from a number of passages in Scripture. Perhaps one of the most telling is in Daniel chapter 3. Now recall how Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah were cast into the fiery furnace by Nebuchadnezzar for refusing to bow down to his golden image. And after they cast into the fiery furnace, we read in chapter 3, verse 24, then Nebuchadnezzar, the king, was alarmed and rose up in haste. He spoke and said unto his ministers, did not we cast 3 men bound into the midst of the fire? They answered and said unto the king, true, O king. Verse 25, he answered and said, lo, I see 4 men loose, walking in the midst of the fire, and they have no hurt. And the appearance of the 4th is like that of an angel. And in our tradition, that last line can be highlighted because, of course, we understand that the 4th was the angel sent by God to rescue Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah from the fiery furnace. Angels are non-physical beings, but we see in many passages in Scripture that it appears that angels can take on a physical form when God deems it appropriate for them to do so. But just consider, where's the angel here. There are three righteous men, there's one angel. We presume that the order with which they're walking is a reflection of rank. The angel is walking behind, not in front. The righteous are greater. This should really come as no surprise to us, of course, considering that, as we read in Genesis chapter 32, the angel with whom Jacob wrestled saw that he prevailed not against him. And ultimately it is Jacob who forces the angel to bless him. And what is that blessing? In Genesis chapter 32, verse 29, your name shall be called no more Jacob, but Israel, for you have striven with godly beings, with angels of God, and with men, and have prevailed. As expressed perhaps more bluntly by the prophet Hosea in chapter 12, verse 5, so he, Jacob, strove with an angel and prevailed. He wept and made supplication unto him. The angel wept. Jacob prevailed. And as we had occasion to note in the past, we consider also the message of God's warning, blessing, delivered by the angel to the prophet Zechariah on behalf of Joshua, the high priest. If you will walk in my ways, and if you will keep my charge, and will also judge my house, and will also keep my courts, then, Zechariah chapter 3, verse 7, I will give you walkers among these standing ones. Your translation may differ. I'm translating the Hebrew literally. I will give you walkers among these standing ones. Who are the walkers? Who are the standing ones? We've noted this in the past. Man is always the walker. Man moves. Man grows. Man comes into the world with but spiritual potential, but nothing actual. It's up to each one of us, by dint of the choices that we make, to actualize ourselves spiritually. We go. We grow. We move. Angels do not. They are created as spiritual beings, and so they remain. But they don't go. They don't grow. As we read in Ezekiel chapter 1, verse 7, their legs were straight. Verse 9, they turned not when they went. Angels are static spiritually. They are the standing ones. Man is not. And precisely because we have the temptation and the opportunity to fail when a human being, with God's help, succeeds, rises, chooses the path of righteousness, it's so much greater. As we read in Job chapter 5, verse 7, man is born to labor. It's always a struggle. The flying beings fly upward. Those are the angels. Man struggles, and by struggling, man can prevail. We see this message with respect to the angels in another vein as well. We'll note this just briefly, and that is the word that we encounter most frequently in the Bible with respect to angels is malach. But malach is not a word that literally or exclusively means angel. It simply means messenger. We consider many examples where malach is used in a perfectly mundane sense as messenger, or it could even be ambiguous, whether it's a human messenger or an angel. But the point to appreciate here is, while we understand why the word for angel is a word that means messenger, because God sends angels as his messengers to human beings, just consider what message that conveys to us. When you send a messenger to someone, there is a presumed rank. The one who's receiving the messenger is always of higher rank than the messenger. You could well send a commoner as a messenger to a king, but you would not send a king as a messenger to a commoner. If angels are sent as messengers to people, obviously that means it's the people who are greater. And indeed, that's the case. Because human beings, through the choices that they make, can be far greater than merely angel-like. They can be godly. Don't take that on my authority. I could tell you it's on the authority of the serpent in paradise, who says that when you eat of the tree of knowing good and evil, you will be as God. But then we wouldn't want to trust his testimony either, would we? What about God's testimony? In Genesis chapter 3, verse 22, and God the Lord said, behold, man is become as one of us to know good and evil. God says, by man having free will, man has become godly. With all the challenges and dangers that entails. But then again, returning to the basic realization that we've already noted, what's so great about striving to be angel-like on Yom Kippur? We're human beings. We should be striving to be far greater than angels, right? And of course the answer is, right. But having the potential to be greater than angels doesn't necessarily mean we succeed. And this inevitably is the central challenge and often tragedy of life. We get ourselves distracted. We should be focused upon what really matters, upon transcending the bounds of physicality, upon indeed becoming what we as human beings are summoned to be. But all too often, we forget, we become distracted, we don't pay attention. There is an insightful definition of being God-fearing that we can glean from Exodus chapter 9, of all places, describing the way the Egyptians reacted to Moses' warning of plague number 7. Now, plague number 7, as expressed in chapter 9, verse 18, is, behold, tomorrow, about this time, I will cause it to rain a very grievous hail, such as has not been in Egypt since the day it was founded, even until now. How grievous a hail? Deadly hail. Verse 19, now, therefore, hasten in your cattle and all that you have in the field. For every man and beast that shall be found in the field and shall not be brought home, the hail shall come down upon them and they shall die. Moses has given the Egyptians fair warning. This hail will be deadly. It shouldn't be too surprising then that we read in verse 20 that he that feared the word of God among the servants of Pharaoh made his servants and his cattle flee into the houses. That doesn't seem as a very lofty level of being God-fearing. After all, Moses has warned of all the previous plagues. There have been 6 to date. He's gone 6 for 6. This is the 7th. These people are prepared to at least entertain the possibility that he might be for real. What seems so enigmatic is, how could anyone not do that? And we get the answer in verse 21. In the Hebrew, it is, V'asher lo sam libo, rendered here as he who regarded not. Perhaps we could better state, he who paid no attention. Literally, he who put not his heart to the word of God, left his servants and his cattle in the field. So how could someone not heed Moses' warning? Very simply, they just didn't pay attention. They were distracted. And all too often in this world, so are we. Perhaps much more so in our generation than previously. We have so many gadgets, so many things to keep ourselves occupied, so many things to distract us from what really matters. There's a goal that all of life is directed to advance. And as much as that should be the goal of everything, often it eludes us because we get ourselves sidetracked. I feel compelled to share with you in this vein, briefly, an interesting anomaly between verses 11 and 12 in Genesis chapter 1. In Genesis chapter 1, verse 11, God summons the earth to bring forth, in the Hebrew it is, Eitz Pri Oseh Pri, which we translate literally as trees of fruit, bearing fruit. In verse 12, the earth delivers trees bearing fruit, but not trees of fruit bearing fruit. It's Eitz Oseh Pri, but not Eitz Pri. What does this mean? You might ask, what difference does it make? While it is certainly a difference of nuance, this is God's word. It's there to teach us something else. In our tradition, the summons, trees of fruit, is a summons to produce trees that are themselves like fruit. You would taste the tree, and it would taste like fruit. The earth, however, did not produce that. The earth produced trees that bear fruit, but the trees are not fruit. The trees are wood. If you try to taste the tree, all you'll taste is the taste of wood. Now, what is this coming to convey to us? I feel compelled to share with you an illuminating insight of one of the great scholars of the late 19th, early 20th century, Rabbi Abraham Isaac HaKohen Kook, the chief rabbi in British Mandatory Land of Israel until his death in 1935. And in considering this tradition, he submitted the following. When we consider what trees symbolize and what fruit symbolizes, trees, certainly fruit-bearing trees, are means. The fruit is the end. The fruit is the final goal. God's summons of the earth was to produce trees that would themselves taste of fruit. A world in which you would feel so keenly the final goal that you would taste that goal in all the intervening means that you need to employ to get to that goal. So the tree itself would taste like fruit. The earth didn't produce that. The earth in our world cannot produce that. In our world, there are trees and there's fruit. They're not the same thing. There are means and there's a goal. And it is indeed possible for us to fixate upon the means and tragically lose sight of the goal. In this world, God's summons remains a challenge for the earth, for us, but not yet a challenge that we can meet. When we focus upon the means and forget about the goal, that, at its root, is exactly what paganism is. Everything, after all, that God created in the world could, on some plane, be used as means to coming to Him. But when we fixate on it instead of seeing it as means to getting to God, it becomes the object of our focus, and we end up worshiping it instead of God. That's paganism. That's what happens when we distract ourselves from the final goal, which is always God, and fixate upon the means. And that, in our lives, in this world, is a constant danger. Which is why, in our lives, in this world, faced as we are with the danger of being distracted, we need Yom Kippur. We need Yom Kippur, it should be stressed, not in order to escape from this world, but rather in order to become reoriented, to appreciate just how we should be relating to this world. In Deuteronomy chapter 8, we read about the manna in a context that may be particularly apropos here. When we read of God afflicting Israel in the wilderness, afflicting, much as on Yom Kippur, we are summoned to afflict ourselves. Same root, same verb. That God afflicted us in order to test us, in order to summon us to rise to the challenge. In Deuteronomy chapter 8, verse 3, he afflicted you and suffered you to hunger. You had no bread, and fed you with manna. And then you weren't hungering anymore, but you still didn't have bread for 40 years. Remember? No bread, as we saw in Deuteronomy chapter 29. He fed you with the manna that he might make you know that man does not live by bread only, but by everything that proceeds out of the mouth of God does man live. Don't be distracted. Focus on what really matters. The bread is simply means. And to the extent that you don't need the means, focus upon the end. Everything has one end, one goal. Coming home to God. That's the only destination. Our problem is the rest of the year, we become so engrossed in so many other things, we forget about this. And then Yom Kippur comes. Not that being angel-like is in any way the goal. It simply means for us to restore the focus on what ultimately is always the goal. Coming to God and letting God in every aspect of our lives. In Psalm 139, verse 16, we read a rather cryptic verse, which indeed is subject to many different interpretations. I'm translating the words of the second half of the verse literally as stated. The verse reads then, "Your eyes did see my unformed substance. In your book they were all written. Days have been formed, and one of them is his." And we have the interpretation that one day that is his, that is God's, is Yom Kippur. There's one other interpretation, which I'll be sharing with you shortly. But on that day, we don't deny ourselves. We don't starve ourselves. We simply rise above being sustained by eating and drinking in order to be sustained by God. And indeed, in that vein, as we read in Psalm 36, "How precious is your loving kindness, O God. And the children of men take refuge in the shadow of your wings. They are abundantly satisfied with the fatness of your house." Obviously not literal fatness, that they don't need that. You make them drink of the river of your pleasures, not physical drink. We are God intoxicated. We are sustained by Him, because with you is the source, the fountain of life. Indeed, likewise, in Proverbs chapter 16, verse 15, in the light of the king's countenance is life. What sustains us is God's light. Everything else is simply secondary. As a result, in Psalm 63, verse 6, my soul is satisfied as with choice foods and fatness. How so? Because my mouth praises you with joyful lips. And when I'm connected with you, God, my soul is satisfied. And my body doesn't interfere. Because my soul is sustaining my body, not the other way around. Indeed, as such, Psalm 111, verse 5, He has given food unto them that fear Him. He will ever be mindful of His covenant. That food is not necessarily physical. It doesn't need to be. As Isaiah expresses it in chapter 55, verse 2, wherefore do you spend money for that which is not bread, and your gain for that which doesn't satisfy? Hearken diligently unto me, says God, and eat that which is good, and let your soul delight itself in fatness, and you will be sustained. When you really get the message of Yom Kippur, you can't possibly feel hungry. You have the ultimate satiation of being satisfied through God. God, who, as expressed in Nehemiah chapter 9, verse 6, gives life to them all, to everything, to the heavens of heavens, all their host, the earth and all things that are thereon, the sea and all that is in them. God sustains everything. And through seizing upon the closeness to Him, we indeed are sustained. And that brings me to one final crucial dimension that we need to consider here. I mentioned in the case of Psalm 139, the implication of verse 16, days have been formed and one of them is His, as according to one tradition alluding to Yom Kippur. There's another tradition, which is that that day, one of them is His, alludes to the holiest day in the biblical calendar. Now, some of you may be wondering, isn't that Yom Kippur? But I trust many of you already realize that the answer to that question, of course, is no. Yom Kippur is not the holiest day on the calendar. We already saw that on Yom Kippur, there is such severity associated with the prohibition on doing creative labor that if one does so, there's the spiritual punishment of one's soul being destroyed by God. That's a very severe punishment, but it's not as severe as capital punishment, as actually being put to death by the court. The punishment for doing that, for doing creative labor on Shabbat, is the death penalty. Shabbat is holier than Yom Kippur. I should stress that the death penalty only pertains when someone has been fully forewarned by witnesses and deliberately insists upon continuing to do what is forbidden. But in principle, the holiest day of the year comes every 7 days. Shabbat, the Sabbath. Just as one additional illustration of this hierarchy, you know, many days of the year, we read the Torah publicly in the synagogue. On ordinary weekdays, 3 passages are read from the Torah on the days when the Torah is read. On minor holy days, that is, the beginning of the months and the intermediate days of the festivals, 4 passages are read. On major holidays, the major holidays of Passover, of Shavuot, the Feast of Weeks, of Sukkot, the Feast of Tabernacles, and the Rosh Hashanah, 5. Yom Kippur is in a class by itself. 6 passages are read. But every week on Shabbat, we read 7. Now, for those who might be wondering, what does this mean? You're making holiness something routine? Of course, the answer is precisely. We're making the routine holy, infusing holiness into every nook and cranny of our lives. Shabbat is indeed the ultimate expression of that. And it's instructive for us to consider the relationship then between Yom Kippur and Shabbat. On the morning of Yom Kippur, the reading from the prophets that is read in synagogues throughout the world is Isaiah chapter 58, which appropriately enough begins, "Is not this the fast that I have chosen? To loose the fetters of wickedness, to undo the bands of the yoke, to let the oppressed go free, and that you break every yoke? Is it not to deal your bread to the hungry, and that you bring the poor that are cast out to your house? When you see the naked, that you cover him, and you hide not yourself from your own flesh, then shall your light break forth as the morning, and your healing shall spring forth speedily, and your righteousness shall go before you. The glory of God shall be your rearward." So indeed, the message of the prophet, the fast that God has chosen, is to not become distracted, to focus on the goal of doing what is right and overcoming all that is wrong, to thwart evil, to side with its victims rather than its perpetrators. That, of course, is very appropriate to getting put on track, focusing on Yom Kippur. But that's not the end of the passage. The end of the passage, ironically enough, in verses 13 and 14, pertains to a different day in the calendar. If you turn away your foot because of the Sabbath, from pursuing your business on my holy day, and call the Sabbath a delight, and the holy of God honorable, and shall honor it, not doing your wanted ways, nor pursuing your business, nor speaking thereof, then you shall delight yourself in God, and I will make you to ride upon the high places of the earth, and I will feed you with the inheritance of Jacob your father, for the mouth of God has spoken. Shabbat, a day of delight, not denial, not because of the need to get ourselves back on track, but rather being on track. Recognizing that God gave us a beautiful world to enjoy. The greatest gift, to be with God, not denying ourselves, not to be angel-like, but rather to be godly human beings, using the great gift of this world that God gave us to come to Him. And that brings us to our closing note, which really pertains to the closing note of Yom Kippur. At the very end of Yom Kippur, the very end of the service, the night when Yom Kippur concludes, the final words that we proclaim in the synagogue, that we shout out, that we yell at the top of our lungs, are the words that the people of Israel yelled after they beheld the miracle of the fire of God coming down from heaven and consuming the burnt offering that the prophet Elijah had placed upon the altar. And when the people saw it, we read in the first book of Kings, chapter 18, verse 39, they fell on their faces and they said, The Lord, He is God. The Lord, He is God. That proclamation, the Lord, He is God. We say it with every fiber of our being. Is that the final note? Almost. The final note isn't what we say. In our tradition, it is what God says to us after those words. Words that we read in Ecclesiastes chapter 9, verse 7. Go your way, eat your bread with joy, and drink your wine with a merry heart, for God has already accepted your works. When we really integrate the message of Yom Kippur, we understand that really is the greatest blessing, the greatest gift, the world that God has given us, so long as we know how to relate to it appropriately as means to come to Him. The greatest blessing. God bless you.